Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. The Bambis are some of the most popular Sternritter in Bleach, but which among them is the strongest? Some of them get more screen time than others, but all 5 of them get to demonstrate their powers in some form or another throughout the war, specifically the second Quincy invasion, when they clash with numerous captain-class enemies across different battles. Now, as always, what constitutes the strongest is a subjective term and forever up for debate, and there's loads to consider here, not least who each individual Bambi is seen to be going up against. But we'll be looking at the performance of each member of the squad individually, as well as their respective shrifts and other feats and traits they display throughout, such as their intelligence, durability, versatility, and more, to try and come to a satisfying conclusion. Not only that, but Kubo himself has thrown his hat into the ring, providing an oddly specific answer over on his Klub Outside platform, which I also want to have a look at here. Also, for the purposes of this video, we'll be looking at the Bambis as they appear strictly in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. I know they all have roles in Can't Fear Your Own World, but we might approach that in another video as some time has passed between the 2 arcs, and for the sake of my own sanity, I'm just sticking to the source material for this one. As always, make sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Am I off base with my ranking here? Do we get to see enough of their powers and skills to settle on a concrete verdict? First of all, let's take a look at what Kubo himself said over on Klub Outside a little while ago now. He was asked a pretty simple question regarding the strength of the Bambis, with translations and clarity provided by both M Shadows and Rarix211. Kubo was asked the following question: is the order of strength within the Bambis Liltotto, Giselle, Meninas, Bambi, and Candice, going from strongest to weakest? And he replied, that's probably the order when battling with Bleach. Hand to hand, however, it's Liltotto, Meninas, Candice, Giselle, Bambietta. It's crucial to remember before we dive further into this that Kubo made zero mention whatsoever of the Bambi's respective shrifts, their Volsten dish, or Can't Fear Your Own World. With Bambietta ranking so low, it's possible he's including her zombified form in this, but again, his answers are oddly specific, referring only to what looks like bare-knuckle fist-fighting, and then the same again, but upgraded to involve Bleach. I do have a couple of thoughts before we move on and widen the net. What I will say, first of all, is that Meninas failing to top either of those categories is kind of interesting to me. As I mentioned, it doesn't seem, on the surface at least, that shrifts are being taken into account here, but every Sternritter's shrift affects them personally on an innate level regardless, whether that's to do with their personality, appearance, or otherwise. For example, Liltotto is always hungry, Bambietta has an explosive, unpredictable temperament, Candice's hair is shaped like lightning bolts, while Giselle's hair is shaped like a cockroach's antenna. So it's not a huge reach to assume there should be some representation of Meninas' the power in her character somewhere, no matter what. So for her to still fall behind Liltotto in just a basic fist fight is a surprise to me. Unless we're stripping away shrifts and their influence on the Quincy entirely, reducing them to ordinary humans, at which point Liltotto must be extremely scrappy to beat Meninas in a hand-to-hand fight, making it even more unlikely. Remember, of course, this is all just speculation and conjecture on my part, but I do try to use what we see in the source material at the same time. The second thing that catches my eye here is that Giselle is second on the hierarchy when fighting with Bleach, but drops all the way down to 4th when Bleach is taken out of the equation. I'll be honest, I can't see Giselle fighting hand-to-hand at all. We'll get into it later, but Giselle reminds me a lot of Asnod. They've got extremely broken shrifts to make up for the fact that physically they seem pretty useless overall, but perhaps that isn't the case here. I don't feel like personally we've really seen any evidence of Giselle's Bleach being particularly strong, although again we'll get into a good example of that potentially being the case later on, because the zombie seemingly makes her immortal anyway. For example, when she survived being stabbed through the chest by Kensei, I always assumed that was due to the zombie and had nothing to do with her apparent proficiency in Bleach, but maybe it did play a role. Perhaps Kubo is ranking her based on her overall durability, but even so, with the zombie taken out of the equation, I can't imagine her defeating Meninas even with Bleach, but Perhaps they're almost totally different when their powers are taken away from them. It's definitely strange, I think, to see Bambietta so low on both lists. Kubo definitely doesn't seem to like this character very much, and I do wonder if he is considering her zombie form here, though again, there's no mention of it. To be fair, based on what we've seen of Bambietta, her shrift seems to be what makes her truly dangerous, so I can somewhat understand it. Perhaps the biggest enigma of the 5 is also the one believed to be the strongest, at least in regards to these two lists here, and that's Liltotto. It's odd that she's penned as the strongest by the person asking the question, as Liltotto is arguably the Bambi we've seen the least from in regards to combat, but Kubo reaffirms it, so they're obviously onto something. Anyway, let's move on and take a look at what each Bambi brings to the table. Unlike Kubo's Q&A, we'll now be blowing this thing wide open and taking a look at everything the Bambis have been shown to be able to do. Let's start things off with Sternritter T, the Thunderbolt Candice Catnip, who I think is likely the weakest of the 5 overall. Once again, I want to reiterate that weakest and strongest are ultimately very difficult and perhaps in a series like Bleach, nearly impossible to truly quantify and define. On top of that, even if she is the weakest Bambi, that still means Candice is an incredibly powerful character in her own right, capable of decimating hordes of most likely unseated Shinigami in the 11th Division with ease. However, based on the evidence we see in the source material, it seems likely to me that Candice would come in at the bottom of the pile. There's an immaturity to this character that isn't shared by the others, save for Bambietta, but hers is slightly different, we'll get to her later, and that immaturity can be found in both her personality, where we see she's reckless and quick to anger, but also in her powers too, with Giselle noting that Candice has only just learned how to use Vollständisch compared to the rest of them. In many ways, Candice kind of feels like a Bambietta light to me, and maybe that's doing her a disservice, but they both have fiery, crackling temperaments and explosive, destructive powers. The difference between them is that Bambietta's shrift focuses on a scorched earth mentality, while Candice's the Thunderbolt is much more focused and more measured by comparison, with most of her abilities like Galvano Blast and Galvano Javelin focused on single combat, acting as electrifying extensions of her bow and arrow. One of the things that makes comparing and contrasting these characters so difficult is that they fight varying degrees of opponents, and there's no denying that ultimately Candice has it pretty bad, duking it out with some of Bleach's biggest monsters. She puts up a decent fight against Ichigo, but at this point he is so far above her by now that he's toying with her, to the point where it seems like he's not even trying to hurt her and she still gets roadblocked at every turn. Then of course she comes up against Byakuya, who is also absurdly strong now thanks to his stint in the Royal Palace. Initially we just saw that she was defeated with ease off screen, but the anime gave us an extra glimpse into their fight. While Candice does go toe to toe with Byakuya, briefly using her lightning blades, you can't deny her tenacity, that's for sure. Interestingly, her Vollständisch seems to actually run out of energy, causing her to revert to her base form in the middle of the fight and be instantly defeated. It's difficult to say whether or not this is a result of her only just learning to use her holy form, or if it's a byproduct of her electrical powers needing to be charged or something like that, but either way it's a big disadvantage that we simply haven't seen any other Sternritter have to deal with. That being said, Candice has a lot of utility in her shrift. I love the creativity behind her ripping off her wings and using them as swords. But the Thunderbolt seems to lack that pure power that something like Bambietta's The Explode packs into every blast. Candice is fairly quick, and again, I really like seeing her transform into lightning itself to move around faster, but she's almost successfully jumped in mid-air by a nearly dead Kenpachi. The anime throws Candice a bone somewhat by having her lightning blast knock Kenpachi out for a bit, while in the original chapter it takes an awful lot of power before he's finally brought down. Circling back to the battle with Byakuya, for a long time it was assumed that Liltotto and Meninas were flat out stronger than Candice because she was defeated by the captain and they weren't, with Meninas even going so far as to indicate that their abilities meant that it made sense for them to still be standing. And while I think that is still true and valid today, it's interesting that the anime's extended fight didn't include Liltotto or Meninas at all, so it's difficult to gauge how involved in the battle royale against Byakuya they actually got. Candice's personality undoubtedly holds her back as well. She's very intent on just charging headfirst into battle without a second thought, even against opponents who are far, far stronger than her, clearly so as well, unable to accept or even realise when she's outclassed. This short-sightedness even costs her in the source material when she attempts to cancel out Ichigo's Getsuga Jujisho despite the massive energy blast being obviously far too much for her to handle. From the expression on her face as well, Candice seems to realise this to some degree as the attack screams towards her, and Ichigo even barks that she needs to dodge it, but perhaps out of pride or foolishness or both, she tries to take it head on regardless, resulting in her losing an arm unnecessarily. So with Candice's seeming relative lack of experience, recently acquired powers, brash personality, and Kubo ranking her dead last when fighting with Bleach, meaning it must be pretty useless in comparison to the others, I'm fairly confident in having Candice at the bottom of the list. Moving on now to the rest of them, and honestly, things become immediately more difficult. Let's talk about Sternritter P, the Power Meninas Macallon next, as I'm inclined to rank her 4th among the Bambis overall. I don't find Meninas to be particularly impressive during the 1000-Year Blood War arc. Her shrift is fairly basic, lacking a lot of the utility that other Sternritter have access to naturally, instead simply giving her superhuman physical strength. And yet, even with this immense strength at her disposal, she doesn't seem capable of achieving much where it counts. Again, Ichigo feels like an unfair opponent to discuss, but she successfully blindsides him, slamming him headfirst into a row of buildings before forcing him into the sky. And even after all of that, presumably with the increased force of her shrift behind it, Ichigo is essentially completely unharmed. Then there's her off-screen battle with Liltotto. After falling victim to Pepe's The Love, Meninas turns on her friend, using the power to rapidly expand the muscles in her arm before punching Liltotto square in the jaw at point-blank range. While we don't see this fight play out, meaning it's impossible to know exactly what went down, we know the result. Liltotto defeats Meninas, ultimately sparing her, and we know she doesn't run away from the fight in the middle of it since she explicitly tells Giselle that she took Meninas out. Unless, of course, she's lying, which seems unlikely. When we next see Liltotto, her Vollständisch is active, but she hasn't sustained any additional injuries, save for a bruised jaw where Meninas struck her initially. So, just how fast and how easily did Liltotto actually put her down? Presumably Liltotto's holy form is present here because she used it to swiftly beat Meninas, but again we can't say for sure. Either way, we know Liltotto pretty handily defeats her, but there is more to discuss here. The fact that Meninas was under the influence of the love at the time means a couple of things. She wasn't in her right mind, but also that she should have been fighting without any inhibitions in order to please Pepe. If Meninas knew that Pepe wanted Liltotto dead, and he did, then in her loved-up state Meninas would have attacked her with everything she had, just like how Hisagi was desperately trying to take down Byakuya. And even without holding back, Meninas still loses, and perhaps without even landing another hit on her target. There is one thing we don't know. Does Meninas transforming her arm in the way she does increase her superhuman strength even further, or is it just a visual representation of the power? Either way, she hits Liltotto in the face at close range with her inflated muscles and barely injures her. This takes me back to Kubo's own ranking of the girls. It's very weird that Liltotto comes out on top in both hand-to-hand combat and combat enhanced with Bleach, but maybe she really is just that strong, despite having the appearance of a child. It's clear that even with the power behind her, immense physical strength, and you would think, to some degree, a natural inclination towards brutal fistfights, Meninas still loses. When your unique ability is superhuman strength, I think it's kind of telling if you still lose to somebody in a punch-up. Still, Meninas, along with Liltotto, does outlast 3 other Sternritter in the battle with Byakuya, with Meninas herself even claiming it's thanks to their specific abilities, though I've never actually been sure why, and like I mentioned earlier, the anime kind of calls into question how involved the two of them really were. Honestly, Meninas reminds me a little of Kang-Do, a Quincy who excels in hand-to-hand combat, but has a shrift that isn't really that useful and honestly pales in comparison to the abilities of their contemporaries, making them look ultimately unimpressive even when it isn't truly their fault. Even her Sklaveri enhanced Volstendish, as revealed in the anime Por Nippora, only grants her a set of dumbbells and eventually an elongated twirling baton. Admittedly, she can use these tools well, as seen when she squares off against Ichigo himself, but they don't add a lot to her repertoire, unlike say Liltotto or Giselle's enhanced holy forms, which increase their user's overall utility. So, speaking of Giselle, this is where things get very murky overall. Sternritter Z the Zombie Giselle duel is my favourite of the Bambis by a wide margin, so let it be known that I'm not playing favourites here. I would probably rank her third overall, placing her right in the middle of the pack. But like I said, this is where it's getting truly tricky. You see, of the five of them, Giselle's shrift is probably the most powerful of the lot, granting her tons of utility as the zombie just has a lot going on. If we return briefly to Meninas, this is exactly what I mean. The power is just so lacking in comparison to the zombie, which has many more options and is just vastly more impressive, to the point where it's flat out unfair. Of the gang, Giselle is the sly trickster, with a fighting style completely different from the rest that makes full use of her shrift. Giselle is a puppet master, using the zombie to control those around her and make them do her bidding, friend or foe, but there's even more to it than that. The zombie also grants Giselle near immortality, allowing her to survive normally fatal injuries and seemingly stitch herself back together again as though nothing happened. As I mentioned earlier, Kubo seems to rate Giselle's Blute very highly, but I wonder what use she even has for Blute with an ability like this that seems to work passively all the time. Such is the extent of Giselle's immortality that it's hard to know what would even kill her. Could Liltotto successfully eat her with the glutton? Could Bambietta's The Explode blast her body to smithereens? Like the other Bambis, Giselle defeats a number of Gotei 13 officers with her powers before facing off against Ichigo. Interestingly, here we see a brief shot of Giselle trying to strike Ichigo with her bare hand, the one single instance of her ever trying to initiate a physical attack like this herself, outside of tormenting Bambietta. And she survives having her neck broken, simply snapping it back into place. And this is where that earlier mention of having a good example of her Blute potentially comes in. Before we attribute that survival to the zombie, I'll remind you that Kirige OP does exactly the same thing thanks to his Blute, so perhaps the same is true here. During the extended anime portion of this fight, we get to see the enhanced version of Giselle's Volstendish as Albiora in action, including her new ability to summon a troop of skeletons to fight for her, their true power unlocked upon their destruction as their bones suddenly pin Ichigo in place. Ideal if Giselle had tried to splash blood on him. Of course, unlike Candice and Meninas before her, Giselle gets an entirely separate second fight, this time against Mayuri and his corpse unit. Here, Giselle uses her zombified servants, Bambietta, Hitsugaya and others to do the fighting for her. Like I said earlier, Giselle does remind me of Asnod. She seems to be a physically frail individual, carried entirely by a very versatile, very powerful, and all-encompassing shrift. She can even use it to heal and repair the bodies of her allies and zombies if they're seriously damaged. Kubo presents her as something of a parasite, a leech, literally clinging onto Bambietta's back for survival. That's not to say Giselle couldn't handle herself in a straight fight, especially if we take Kubo's own fistfight hierarchy into account, but she's defeated immediately by Zombie Kensei, who simply stabs her through the chest, and Giselle doesn't put up a fight at all. And rather than try and battle it out any further, Giselle slinks away, clearly struggling as she bleeds out profusely. But you know, I'd argue that this is an example of another feather in Giselle's cap. She's smart. Certainly smarter than the other Bambis save for Liltotto, and she knows when she's beaten and when to retreat. By draining Bambietta of the blood she gave her, Giselle is able to rejuvenate herself once more too. So Giselle is a fascinating one, and like I said, very hard to rank accurately. She doesn't fight like any of the other Bambis whatsoever, often hanging back and letting her slaves do the hard work instead. Her Shrift, the zombie, is perhaps the most powerful of the bunch, and certainly is the most versatile, offering Giselle immortality, control, and even healing options. If anything, Giselle is a bit of a slow starter. She's reactive, taunting her enemies and tricking them into making the first move so that she can then work her nefarious magic. The other Bambis don't need to do that, and are all able to strike while the iron is hot. And let's not forget that Giselle's power doesn't work as easily on fellow Quincy. With all that being said, I simply don't see how Candice or Meninas would ever defeat her in a fight. Neither of them has really been shown to have the killing power necessary to keep Giselle down for good. Alright, I know I've said this with each different character so far, but this is tough. Honestly, I feel like the top three are potentially interchangeable to some degree, but in second place I'm putting the so-called leader of the Bambis herself, Sternritter E the Explode, Bambietta Bastarbine. Bambietta is an interesting character. Of the five of them, she's the most bloodthirsty by far, flashes of madness and glee spreading across her face whenever she does battle. I said earlier that I felt Candice was something of a Bambietta light, and I stand by that. Bambietta is fury incarnate among the Bambis and comes across almost unhinged at points. This is reflected in the wild, untamed nature of her Shrift, the Explode, which is perhaps the most dangerous on this list. On the surface, the Explode is quite simple and seemingly doesn't offer much in the way of utility or versatility, but in this case, it simply doesn't need to. Bambietta is able to launch orbs of reishi, which, upon coming into contact with anything, whether it's an inanimate object like a building, or even the body of her opponent, transforms that target into a deadly bomb. The amount of pure destruction that Bambietta is capable of raining down endlessly upon her victims turns her into a true representation of an angel of death, unleashing a storm of hellfire from the skies above. Even before she's activated her holy form, Bambietta's short fuse makes her an unpredictable menace. In the anime, we see her transform her own medallion into an explosive, killing a number of Shinigami with a flick of her wrist, as well as generating a violent blast that swallows up a massive portion of the city simply by swelling her own Reiatsu. The true threat of her Shrift lies in the fact that she isn't just launching bombs. Bambietta utilizes reishi, the very makeup of the world of Bleach, to create a weapon that simply can't be guarded against. Bambietta's bombs cannot be stopped, and in her holy form Zophiel, well, she's capable of flooding the entire battlefield in a continuous non-stop flurry of immense explosions. She's also an adept swordsman, carving through members of the 7th Division with ease. Just don't expect to ever see that sword again. More pressingly, Bambietta's the Explode is capable of one-shotting a captain just like that, swatting Shinji aside in the blink of an eye the moment she transforms. As I mentioned earlier, her preferred method of fighting is Scorched Earth, to simply obliterate everything and anything both in her path and just in the nearby vicinity, leaving nothing in her wake. Bambietta's a loose cannon for sure, and Kubo placing her dead last in a battle with Bleach is interesting. It's possible he is referring to her zombified form here, but since there's no proof of that, another explanation is that Bambietta simply never bothered to improve her Bleach since she never expected anyone to get close to her in the first place. A reasonable guess considering her abilities. But that being said, I'm not sure Bambietta's Bleach being that bad really makes sense either. She tanks Dangai Joy's blade at the end of their fight, only defeated because she's blown up by her own bombs. If her Bleach really is so poor, would that have been possible? Anyway, Bambietta is similar to Giselle and other characters of that ilk, where they rely heavily on the overwhelming and frankly broken force of their shrift, and why wouldn't she, when it's capable of flattening the battlefield and taking out captains in a single hit. Of course, Bambietta, like a lot of these Sternritter, comes up against a pretty unfair opponent in the immortal Komamura, but there's still some interesting things to take away from their fight. Like I said, against a regular captain, it seems Bambietta was able to deal with Shinji no problem whatsoever, but even against Komamura and his undead bankai, we can see the level of damage caused by Bambietta's bombs. One blast is enough to shatter Dangai Joe's hand completely. She's also fast, with excellent command of her holy form's flight, and to Bambietta's credit, while I don't think she's the smartest of the group, and her apparent insanity does cause her to act rashly and without concern, she is aware enough to realise when she's completely outmatched, and even tries to flee from Komamura before he ultimately defeats her. Bambietta is firmly focused on slaughtering her enemies, and her uncontrollable rage is bad news for everyone around. Even Giselle remarks that Bambietta has the power to end the fight quickly, though again she notes it's due to the girl having very little control over herself. Then of course there's Zombietta, which honestly feels like a totally different character in many ways. Naturally, she's much weaker now, more timid, more reserved and submissive, though her explosive powers are still fairly impressive, though she is a good bit weaker than she was previously. Of course, if Zombietta was the focus here, then I think she'd undoubtedly tumble down the list. But looking at Bambietta in her prime, as we are doing with the other Bambis, her pure, destructive, raw strength is, I think, unmatched among them. Don't forget that in her Volstern she's able to fling these things with seemingly no limit, unleashing a rain of blasts with reckless abandon on a near constant basis. It might be quite simple, but it's unbelievably powerful, and to top it all off, Bambietta achieves all of this without ever enhancing her holy form. I wonder what damage she could have wrought if she had. Which means, coming in at number 1 is the ever-mysterious Sternritter G the Glutton Liltotto Lamperd. While initially appearing to be an almost psychotic, foul-mouthed child, Liltotto's character grew and evolved over time, transforming her into the level-headed mediator of the group. Clearly the smartest of the bunch, and perhaps even the true leader of the Bambis, Liltotto is an oddball character, and I do feel a bit weird placing her at number 1, purely because we don't see much from her at all. Like the rest of them, she's an adept bowmaster, and according to Kubo himself, she tops the list in regards to physical strength, defeating the rest of the Bambis in either a straight fist fight or a battle enhanced by Bleach, meaning there's more to this character than meets the eye. And that's never better exemplified than by her shrift, the Glutton, which warps this picture of innocence into a horrific, nightmarish, eldritch monstrosity, her jaw transforming into a massive, sharp-toothed maw capable of devouring entire Shinigami and Quincy whole. We see Liltotto, without much effort whatsoever, consume large numbers of 11th Division soldiers, her mouth extending and contorting to snatch them up, preventing them from escaping as they scream at her in pure terror. And as we see when she confronts Pepe over his betrayal, Liltotto devours him with ease, killing the Sternritter and gulping him down piece by piece. I always wondered why Pepe never bothered to even try and fight back, but perhaps Liltotto's reputation precedes her. Maybe he figured he didn't stand a chance. It's hard to know for sure. Liltotto battles Ichigo along with the other Bambis, and is the only one of the 4 of them to know who he is, preparing her expectations accordingly. She's also the only one who catches him even remotely off guard, her colossal jaw managing to snag his cloak, much to his surprise. In the anime's version of the fight, we see Liltotto's enhanced holy form Gagael, and suddenly she has a lot more versatility under her belt, gaining a plethora of abilities that allow her to fight both up close and at range. Spork fires an extremely high-speed snapping jaw with the power to effortlessly punch through a building, while Spife unfurls a razor-sharp whip for Liltotto to strike with from afar. Meanwhile, Golden Crunch allows Liltotto to set a trap up on the ground, capturing the unaware in its enormous fangs. though Ichigo is strong enough to keep it from closing. As I've said ad nauseum at this point, Ichigo is so immensely powerful that it's hard and unfair, really, to use him as a yardstick. Instead, you just have to see what each Bambi brings to the table and how they deal with him in their own way. And then, of course, like Meninas, she outlasts several other Sternritter against Byakuya before quickly dispatching of Meninas herself after her friend falls victim to Pepe's the Love. As mentioned during Meninas' section, Liltotto seemingly defeats her with ease and without sustaining many, if any, injuries after the initial punch, which also barely wounds her. And while we're only discussing the characters as they appeared in the 1000 Year Blood War arc today, Can't For Your Own World reveals that Liltotto's the Glutton allows her to wield, even if only temporarily, the powers of those she eats. So that'll be something extra to consider in the future as well. As we come to the end then, Liltotto is a bit of an enigma. Unlike almost every other Sternritter, she seems to be of completely sound mind. Even after Basby sneak attacks them, blasting each of them with Burner Finger, which they all shrug off by the way, Liltotto is willing to work with him, aware that they need to reach Ichigo in order to receive Yhwach's graces and reward. Of the 5 of them, she's possibly the Bambi we see the absolute least of, yet the signs are there that among them she is perhaps the strongest of the lot. The Glutton too feels like an unknown quantity. What's its limit? Could it devour Bambietta's bombs in mid-flight? Would that protect Liltotto from the explosions or not? Would Liltotto be able to eat Giselle and permanently kill her? Considering the apparent ease at which Liltotto stopped Meninas, who by all rights should have been fighting to kill, it's hard to imagine her struggling much against the others. But that's it for the video and my ranking of the Bambis. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it. I've tried to take absolutely everything into account, but honestly, it is pretty difficult to do overall, especially when there are so many mitigating factors and differing variables, such as who they fought and what abilities they have. It's actually a little bit exhausting when you think about it like that. In the end, I've got them ranked as follows. From weakest to strongest, we've got Candice, Meninas, Giselle, Bambietta, and finally Liltotto, but it did get murkier and murkier as the list went on, and really the top 3 could be moved around pretty liberally, I imagine. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to leave your lists and thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to see how similar our opinions are, or if we differ completely. Regardless, do please let me know. And as always, I want to end this video by saying a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. Your support really does mean the absolute world to me. And if you like what I do here over on YouTube and you want to support me over on Patreon, you can do just that to get your name in the credits like this and to get every video I release completely ad-free. Alright guys, but that's it from me. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.